pulse of the Earth over millennia, a process that is, in itself, profoundly restful to contemplate. It is here, far beneath the modern prairie topsoil and the unassuming bedrock of the Mississippian period, that the Keoko, the Star Eaters, left their first, and most perplexing, mark. The initial discovery, in the spring of 1974, was not made by an archaeologist, but by a geological survey team boring a preliminary shaft for a deep storage facility near what is now the northern border of the Oklahoma Panhandle. The drill logs, which we must examine with a quiet attention to detail, first registered an unusual density anomaly at approximately 180 meters below the surface. Geologists, being practical people, initially dismissed this as a localized intrusion of high-density metamorphic rock, perhaps a rare iron-rich dike. However, the core samples that followed told a distinctly different story. A narrative told not in the language of cooled magma, but in the deliberate architecture of an unknown hand. The problem of the layered glass, the material pulled from the 180-meter depth, was not granite, nor basalt, but a finely structured composite. It was primarily obsidian, the naturally occurring volcanic glass known for its lethal sharpness and characteristic conchoidal fracture. Now, the presence of obsidian in this region is not unusual. Obsidian sources are scattered across the West, and indigenous trade networks transported it thousands of miles. But the Keoko obsidian, which we have catalogued under the rather dry classification of composite material 4-5A, presented two unique and startling characteristics that defy conventional archaeological and geological explanation. First, its purity. Analysis of the trace elements, the minute proportions of iron, magnesium, and alkali metals showed an almost monolithic consistency. While naturally occurring obsidian from a single flow will show slight variations over its extent, the Keoko samples were chemically identical across hundreds of meters of excavated material. This suggested a process of refinement, a degree of material science that is, quite frankly, staggering for a civilization that by all other metrics should precede metalworking by thousands of years. It suggests the Keoko possessed a method of heating, melting, and homogenizing volcanic glass on an industrial, yet precise, scale. We must pause here, allowing the sheer scale of this hypothetical operation to gently permeate our understanding. Imagine the sustained, intense heat required, the engineering needed to contain and manipulate a substance at its flow temperature, all without a known metallurgy. Second, the structure itself, the obsidian bones. The core samples revealed that the obsidian was not a solid block, but a complex, multi-layered matrix. It was layered with alternating sheets of the pure, black volcanic glass and a thin, whitish-gray layer of pulverized pumice and trace limestone. This layering was not haphazard. It was organized into hexagonal, load-bearing units, much like the internal structure of cancellous bone. Dr. Aris Thorne, who first published the comprehensive analysis in 1998, proposed that this structure provided shock absorption and anti-shear properties far superior to solid stone, or even modern reinforced concrete. He formally dubbed this architectural style the osteological matrix, which is the technical term for a bone-like structure, and the name obsidian bones has since become its more poetic, if less sleep-inducing, moniker, the obsidian bones. Therefore, are not simple ruins. They are the load-bearing elements of a subterranean city built entirely from refined volcanic glass and mineral composite. The structures form vast, echoing galleries and immense, sloping vaults. A city constructed to withstand pressures from the earth above. A society that chose to live not on the world, but within it. The question of depth and dating, this leads us directly to the most tranquilizing, yet unsettling, aspect of the Keoko enigma, its absolute age and position. Through multiple methodologies, carbon-14 dating of trace organic residue within the pumice layers, thermoluminescence dating of the fire-treated rock, and most compellingly, the stratigraphy of the overlying geological strata, we have arrived at a consensus dating of approximately 17,500 to 20,000 years. Before present, BP. Let that number settle gently into your mind. 20,000 years ago, this dating places the Kayokul not just before the Mississippian cultures, not just before the Olmec or the Maya, but squarely within the time frame of the Paleo-Indian period in North America, the era of the Clovis culture, of small nomadic hunter-gatherer groups pursuing megafauna across the continent. To find a sprawling, engineered subterranean city requiring advanced material science and complex social organization within this temporal window presents a profound intellectual challenge. It is not merely an anomaly. It is a recalibration of our entire understanding of human development in the Americas. This radical dating is the quiet hinge upon which our question turns: geological anomaly or first contact. For years, the orthodox position held by the deeply conventional and therefore highly soothing geological community was that the entire Obsidian Bones Formation was an unusual tectonic event. The theory suggested that a localized, ancient volcanic eruption, hitherto uncatalogued, had forced a glassy magma intrusion into a series of highly regular, pre-existing fault lines, and that the subsequent layering was simply the result of differential cooling, mineral precipitation, and seismic compression. It is a neat, tidy explanation, one that allows the history books to remain closed. It eliminates the need for an unknown civilization, but the theory fractures, much like the glass itself, under the weight of detailed examination. The layers are too regular, the hexagonal units too precise. The composite material shows no sign of the massive thermal stress expected from a natural intrusion. And most importantly, there are the etchings. The signatures in the silence embedded within the obsidian bones are vast, polished surfaces, acting as mirrors in the subterranean gloom. On these surfaces, the Kayokul left their only clear communication, the linear glyphs of the deep. These are not cave paintings, nor pictograms depicting hunting scenes. They are precise, abstract arrangements of lines, dots, and carefully rendered geometric shapes, etched with a tool of unimaginable hardness, possibly the very same refined obsidian. The initial analysis, led by the quiet diligence of linguist Dr. Helen Taussig, showed that these glyphs adhere to a strict, highly redundant grammatical structure. They are not merely decorative. They are informational. And while the full language remains undeciphered, a topic we shall explore in a later, equally calming Section 1, recurrent motif has consistently resisted a simple geological interpretation. This motif is known as the three-pointed starburst enclosure. It appears at every major junction, every load-bearing nexus, and along every access ramp within the excavated city section. It is a perfect equilateral triangle enclosing a six-pointed star, surrounded by three smaller, equidistant dots. This symbol, according to Taussig, is a deliberate exographic marker, a symbolic representation of a conceptual object placed outside the known Kayokul environment. For the theory of first contact to gain its gentle footing, we must interpret this symbol. If it is not a star, and the Kayokul are indeed the star-eaters of later tangential folklore, then what is its purpose? The argument for first contact suggests that the advanced material science, the subterranean isolation, and the astronomical symbols were not developed in situ, but were the result of an external stimulus, a cultural seed from a civilization or entity that interacted with the Paleo-Indians, providing them with the knowledge and the means to create the obsidian bones. The Kayokul, in this view, are the cultural descendants of this brief, silent interaction. They built their city not to hide from the earth, but to establish a refuge on the earth. Based on specifications given from another, The logic is chillingly sound. Only a technology far beyond the Clovis horizon could refine obsidian to such a purity and engineer a structure of this scale. The fact that the city is subterranean further suggests a knowledge of, or a desire to hide from, the cataclysmic surface events of the late Pleistocene epoch, such as the Younger Dryas impact eventa, knowledge that a nomadic hunter-gatherer society would not inherently possess, the architecture of isolation. As we conclude this first foundational layer of the Keokol mystery, let us briefly walk through the discovered segment of their city, letting the quiet scale of their isolation wash over us. The main passage, nicknamed the Dormant Artery, is 15 meters high and 25 meters wide, sloping downwards at a gentle, consistent angle of 1.2 degrees. The walls are seamless panels of the obsidian bones, cool to the touch and acoustically deadening. Sound does not echo here. It is simply absorbed, a perfect environment for the boring history for sleep audience and one suspects. For a people who valued silence above all else. Leading off the artery are a series of storage compartments, perfectly sealed, triangular vaults containing no artifacts whatsoever. They are empty, pristine, and structurally sound after 20,000 years. Their existence suggests meticulous planning for long-term preservation of something. Yet the nature of that something remains a perfect, soothing void. The most complex feature discovered is the central refinement chamber. This chamber, roughly the size of a modern concert hall, is ringed by circular depressions, each lined with a ceramic composite, not yet identified, that appears capable of withstanding extreme sustained heat. This is the hypothetical location where the raw volcanic glass was melted and purified. The sheer volume of the chamber is the ultimate rebuttal to the geological anomaly theory. A natural intrusion does not create a dedicated manufacturing facility. The obsidian bones, therefore, are the ultimate artifact of the Keoko. They are the proof of a science that should not exist in the American Paleo-Indian period. Whether they are the silent testimony of a forgotten, genius native population who mastered the Earth's elements, or the physical remnant of a brief, strange communion with something external, is the soothing mystery that binds the entire Keokol enigma together. It is a question designed not to generate alarm, but to gently occupy the peripheral consciousness as we drift towards rest. In the next section, we will delve into the philosophical heart of this silent civilization, examining the terrifying implications of their calendrical system, the calendar of backward time. But for now, let the cold, quiet geometry of the subterranean obsidian bones be your final thought. If the subterranean, obsidian bones provided the physical anchor for the Keokol civilization, then their unique calendrical system provided the intellectual and spiritual framework, a system so profoundly inverted that it suggests a people existing not merely in time, but constantly contemplating its cessation. We are speaking now of the Keokol Temporal Registry, or, as it is popularly and far more poetically known, the calendar of backward time, the discovery of the temporal spire. The primary source for this knowledge was not found within the deep, silent galleries of the obsidian bones, but high above, on a wind-swept mesa known to modern archaeologists as Site Beta 7. A PPROX IMATEL 40 kilometers north of the main subterranean city. This location, contrary to the Keokol's preference for being within the earth, was a place of high elevation and acute astronomical visibility. Here, a single, monolithic structure survived the millennia of erosion, the temporal spire. The spire is an object of perplexing simplicity. It is a column of the same refined, non-fracturing obsidian, rising precisely 47.19 meters into the air. Crucially, it is not merely a marker. It is an instrument. The spire's surface is covered with a dizzying, yet highly organized array of petroglyphs, not the linear glyphs of the deep, but specialized. Circular markings that track the shadows of the sun, moon, and visible planets across the Mesoamerican sky. The spire's most remarkable feature, however, is a series of precisely drilled, incredibly fine holes that pierce the obsidian at geometrically determined points. These holes are aligned with millimeter accuracy to track the celestial movements of stars that were visible in the Paleo-Indian sky 20,000 years ago, accounting for the proper motion of the stars and the precession of the equinoxes. This level of astronomical precision implies a massive, long-term observational period, spanning potentially thousands of years, to accurately plot these movements. A sophisticated mathematical system to encode this data into a fixed physical structure. This precision serves as the foundation for the calendar of backward time, the inverted philosophy of time, and like nearly every known ancient civilization from the Maya to the Egyptians, the Greeks to the Chinese, the Kayoko did not perceive time as a linear progression from a beginning, creation, toward a future, destiny, nor as a perpetually recurring cycle, rebirth. The Kayoko conceived of time as a finite resource running from an absolute, fixed endpoint, the omega, for the Kayoko. The present moment was not a progression toward the future. It was a retreat away from the omega. Their entire calendar was a measure of how much time they had successfully traversed backwards from the moment of cessation. To count forward was illogical. It implied accumulation. To count backward was existential. It implied expenditure, the fundamental unit of Kayoko time, which we translate as the cool, the glimpse, was measured by the exact time between two specific astronomical alignments, a period roughly equivalent to 52 of our modern years. The Kayoko calendar did not begin at 0 cool, but at an immense number, the great count, and then subtracted 1 cool with each successful temporal cycle. Let us ponder the profound philosophical implication of this system. A society that counts backward is a society focused entirely on reduction and entropy. Every completed cycle, every rising and setting of the sun, was not a step toward growth or renewal, but a successful, quiet step away from the final moment. This worldview is entirely consistent with the architectural choice of the Obsidian Bones, a city built for permanent, silent refuge designed to minimize interaction with the chaotic surface world, thereby slowing their retreat from the Omega. Decoding the chrononauts. Key to understanding the backward calendar lies in the Kayoko concept of the chrononauts of the peaks. This term refers to the elite astronomer priests who inhabited the temporal spire and managed the calendar. These chrononauts were not concerned with predicting the future, since the future was already a known fixed point, the Omega. Their entire mission was temporal synchronization. They sought to align the measured time of the Kayoko with the perceived time of the heavens. The specific glyphs on the temporal spire reveal 4 distinct tracks, analogous to the gears of a complex clock, which they meticulously tracked. The solar retreat, Kuo Ra, tracking the sun's position relative to the solstices and equinoxes. This determined the most basic unit of time subtracted, the annual debit. The lunar quiet, Kuo Yo, a highly complex 28-year cycle that accounted for the lunar wobble and orbital variations. This was used to regulate Kyoku societal and agricultural schedules. The planetary stillness, Kuwukot, tracking the visible, non-stellarly defined planets, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and their retrograde motions. This served as a correction factor, an observation of celestial chaos used to confirm the reliability of the other 2 tracks. The stellar anchor, Cool C, the most critical track. This was a direct observation of the slow, massive shift of the heavens over millennia. This track was used to calculate the total remaining time until the Great Count reached 0, the Omega. The chrononauts were essentially historians of the past and the future. They measured their successful distance from the end, and their primary function was to ensure the collective memory of the Kyoku was not lost during this slow retreat. The paradox of perfection. Why they stopped counting. The most fascinating mystery of the backward calendar is its abrupt cessation. The spire's markings stop precisely at a specific date, which we have calculated to correspond to 16,800 BP. There are no signs of vandalism, no erasure, no seismic damage. The counting simply stops. This is not a collapse. It is an intentional suspension. Dr. Elias Vance, a leading researcher on this topic, posits the paradox of perfection theory. This suggests that the Kyoku did not vanish because their calendar failed, but because it succeeded. If the Kyoku believed their purpose was the quiet, successful subtraction of time until they reached a state of ultimate stillness, zero time, then the final period marked on the spira, period Vance calls the zero shift, was the moment they achieved their goal. The Kyoku may have reached a calculated moment of perfect synchronization with the universe's own timeline of entropy. They did not need to count backward anymore, because they had successfully retreated to a state of stasis, where their internal time ran parallel to the celestial omega point. This theory aligns eerily with the physical structure of the city. Why build vast, empty storage compartments? Why engineer a building material for shock absorption and silence? Perhaps these structures were built for the stillness, the period after the counting stopped. The Kyoku were waiting not for an event to happen, but for the entire universe to catch up to their chosen state of perfect, silent retreat, Kyoku society, and the temporal strain. This inverted relationship with time must have profoundly shaped Kyoku society. Imagine living in a culture where every minute brings you one step closer to a defined end, where success is measured not by growth, but by successful avoidance. Social structure. The chrononauts, holding the keys to the total remaining time, likely possessed immense power, acting as temporal regulators rather than religious leaders. Their role was to enforce the quiet and the meticulousness required for a successful retreat. Austerity. There is a notable absence of decorative art or individualistic artifacts. The focus was on the eternal, abstract forms, the perfect geometry of the glyphs, the purity of the obsidian. Any indulgence was a potential temporal waste, speeding up their expenditure of the remaining kuo. The 0 hour, the daily rhythm of the Kyoku was likely dictated by the spire's shadow. The moment the shadow reached a certain point on the dial, a period they called the Tim-Kiku, the Great Debt, was a time of communal meditation on their temporal responsibility, a moment of profound, shared silence. This structured, daily reflection on their collective end is the ultimate expression of their backward counting mindset. The calendar of backward time is, ultimately, the Kyoku's magnificent, terrifying masterpiece. It is the clearest evidence that their civilization was driven by an obsessive, shared goal of temporal management, a goal that culminated in a sudden deliberate halt. They were a people who knew the end, not through prophecy, but through mathematics. This silence, the cessation of the count at 16,800 BP, is perhaps the most restful mystery of all. It invites us to consider the quiet perfection of a goal achieved, a responsibility fulfilled. The Kyoku, the chrononauts of the peaks, simply stopped measuring because perhaps they had arrived. As you drift towards your own period of stillness, allow the idea of the retreating shadow on the temporal spire to gently guide your thoughts. We have measured their time. Now we must understand their society's silence. In our next segment, we will descend back into the obsidian bones to explore how this philosophy of temporal reduction translated into their daily lives in the Great Stillness, a society's perfect silence, and the role of the whisperers, the Kyoku's decision to retreat underground. A physical move detailed in our first section. was mirrored by a corresponding psychological and social retreat. This was a direct manifestation of their temporal philosophy. If time was a finite resource running backward from a known end, then any expenditure of energy, any unnecessary sound, motion, or emotion was a regrettable act of temporal waste. The function of Kyoku society, therefore, was to manage and minimize this waste through the cultivation of the great stillness, the engineered environment, acoustics and quiescence. Unique properties of the obsidian bones were not accidental. They were functional requirements for this life of stillness. The material itself, the refined volcanic glass, possesses an unusually high coefficient of acoustic dampening. Sound waves striking the surface of the layered composite do not reflect. They are rapidly absorbed and dissipated into the matrix of the pumice interlayers. The effect, within the vast subterranean galleries, is one of profound, immediate sound death. Imagine the dormant artery, 25 meters wide and perfectly smooth, yet completely devoid of echo. A footfall, if loud enough, would travel only a few meters before being entirely consumed by the walls and ceiling. This engineered silence removed one of the primary drivers of societal chaos: uncontrolled, reactive noise. Further enforcing this stillness was the Kyoku's meticulous management of airflow and thermal regulation. Studies of the ventilation shaft's narrow, helical passages that rise almost 180 meters to the surface show that they were designed to create a continuous, low-velocity, non-turbulent movement of air. This air movement prevented the development of strong convection currents, which can carry and amplify sound. The city's temperature was maintained at a constant 17.5 circ text C dollar, approximately $63 way circ text F dollar. The optimal temperature for human quiescence and minimal metabolic rate. Requiring no thermal effort from the inhabitants, the Kyoku lived in a perpetual, sensory-mitigated environment, a state of deliberate, engineered isothermia and isophony, constant temperature and constant sound level, which was near zero. This constant environment was conducive to the meditative, low-energy life demanded by the backward calendar, the nonverbal, compact language of the body in a society where sound was a waste product. Verbal language was necessarily relegated to the absolute periphery of communication. The Kyoku developed what Dr. Taussig termed the nonverbal compact, a sophisticated system of movement and subtle, tactile interaction. The primary method of interpersonal communication was nodal posture. This was not the exaggerated gestures of sign language, but a highly formalized, minimal shift in body alignment. For instance, a change in the angle of the head, regulated to less than $a circ dollar, could convey agreement or negation. The shift of weight from the heel to the ball of the foot, done without perceptible movement of the rest of the body, was the signal for a transition in focus or topic. The precise, regulated distance maintained between two individuals, measured in increments of the Kyoku linear unit. The tor, approx. 10.8 centimeters, conveyed social standing, intention, and emotional availability. This language required intense, constant focus, training the entire Kyoku population into a state of unwavering physical control. Every movement was a deliberate act of communication or non-communication. Imprecision in movement was considered rudeness. Unnecessary movement was considered temporal theft. A less frequently used, but crucial, form of communication was resonance signing. When information transfer required more precision than nodal posture allowed, for instance, during technical or chronological updates, two Kyoku individuals would place the palms of their hands lightly against each other. Through minute, controlled pressure changes and subtle vibrational patterns, a form of tactile Morse code, they could transmit complex data. This system was slow, intimate, and highly regulated, ensuring that it was only used when absolutely necessary. The overall societal effect of this communication protocol, was a profound sense of shared, quiet intentionality. A visitor to the Obsidian Bones, had one existed, would perceive an entire city moving in a slow-motion ritualistic dance, where millions of subtle data points were exchanged with minimal energy expenditure, austerity of life, subsistence and necessary consumption. Commitment to the great stillness dictated an existence of extreme austerity. Kyoko daily life was entirely devoted to minimizing resource consumption and maximizing efficiency, the ultimate expression of temporal debt reduction. 1. Sustenance. The Kyoko were not hunter-gatherers. Their food source was an example of their technical sophistication: lumin algae cultivation. Within the central, sealed vaults adjacent to the refinement chamber were massive pools dedicated to growing highly caloric, genetically optimized subterranean algae. This algae was grown using a controlled, artificial light source, a technology still not fully understood, that mimicked the necessary spectrum for rapid growth. The food required no hunting, minimal processing, and produced minimal waste. 2. Dwelling. The Kyoko did not possess homes in the conventional sense. They lived in quiescent nodes, small, hexagonal alcoves etched into the obsidian bones. These nodes contained only a thermal mat and a small, smooth shelf. There were no personal decorations, no artifacts of leisure, and no visible signs of individualized history. The focus was entirely on functionality and the shared, collective goal of stillness. 3. Anti-culture. Perhaps the most compelling absence is that of art, music, or play. Any activity that generates non-essential sensory input or promotes uncontrolled emotion was strictly avoided. Their intellectual pursuits were focused exclusively on the abstract, the study of the temporal registry, the perfection of nodal posture, and the meticulous maintenance of the environmental systems. The Kyoko achieved cultural stability by aggressively suppressing cultural variance. Their existence was a continuous, organized retreat, a society optimized for entropy. The authority of the Whisperers, Kukultem. To enforce this extreme societal discipline, a small, highly specialized caste was required, the Kukultem, or the Whisperers. The Whisperers were the functional and spiritual nexus of the Great Stillness. They were drawn from the ranks of the chrononauts, the most mathematically and temporally disciplined individuals, but their role was to translate the abstract principles of the backward calendar into concrete, daily social law. The role as regulators. Their primary function was to regulate the social energy flow. They moved through the dormant artery and the feeder passages, observing the nodal postures and the distances between individuals. They were living, moving instruments of social physics, correcting any excessive movement or any visible sign of emotional turbulence. The tonal communication. The name Whisperers is a misleading translation. They did not whisper in the sense of soft, audible speech. Instead, they utilized a complex, low-frequency, tonal language. Analysis of the geometric etchings in their specialized, isolated nodes suggests they used their vocal cords to produce sustained, harmonic frequencies that were often below the normal range of human hearing. Form of regulated infrasound. This was the only form of vocalized communication permitted. A whisperer would deliver a tonal pronouncement, a precisely pitched and timed low-frequency vibration, to an individual who had committed a temporal infraction. This sound was not used to convey words. It was used to convey regulation. The specific frequency and duration of the tone would instantly trigger a physiological and psychological response in the recipient, reinforcing the desired state of stillness and quiescence. It was a form of nonverbal, physiological correction, the sacred duty. The Whisperers were seen not as rulers, but as harmonic maintainers. Their existence was necessary to ensure the collective temporal integrity of the Kyoko. They were the only ones who could introduce a controlled, calibrated burst of energy, sound, to prevent a greater, uncontrolled release of energy, chaos, or emotion. Their authority was absolute, rooted not in physical might, but in the abstract, unquestionable necessity of the backward calendar, the architecture of memory. The stillness nodes, the architectural map of the obsidian bones, reveals specific chambers. Far from the dormant artery, known as the stillness nodes, these were small, spherical chambers lined not with dampening obsidian, but with polished, highly reflective quartz composite. In these rooms, the Kaoko would perform their final societal ritual, the memory reduction, since the culture was focused on retreating from time. The concept of personal, individual memory was an impediment, a temporal drag. The stillness nodes were places where Kaoko individuals would enter into deep, prolonged states of meditation, assisted by the low, continuous frequency hum emitted by the reflective quartz walls, likely induced by a nearby whisperer. The goal was the controlled dissipation of autobiographical memory, reducing the self to its most essential, present function. This process of memory reduction further solidified the Great Stillness. A society without individual history is a society without internal conflict, regret, or ambition, the primary generators of disruptive energy. The Kaoko were a collective consciousness focused entirely on the present moment of retreat. The entire civilization was a magnificent, tragic experiment in controlled human entropy. They engineered their environment, regulated their movements, minimized their sustenance, and suppressed their memories, all to achieve a single, profound goal: the successful expenditure of all remaining time in perfect, unchanging stillness. The Great Stillness was the logical conclusion of the Kagyoko philosophy. It was a social structure built to last for thousands of years, in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the celestial clock to complete its final, inevitable count. This takes us to the edge of the final, most unsettling mystery, the precise nature of their successful end. What happened when the great count finally reached the zero shift? In our concluding section, we will gently explore the final moments of this magnificent, silent culture, echoes of the Star Eater, the vanishing, and the legacy of the unbuilt. Rest now, under the perfect, engineered silence of the obsidian bones. Our three previous segments have established the Kaoko civilization as a society meticulously engineered for temporal reduction. They built a city designed to absorb chaos, they calculated time backward toward entropy, and they cultivated a social stillness intended to minimize all unnecessary energy expenditure. The logical conclusion of such a civilization is not collapse, but perfect cessation, a final, deliberate alignment with the zero point of the universe. This brings us to the most defining characteristic of the Kaoko, the vanishing, the evidence of absence. No cataclysm, no corpse's archaeological investigation into the obsidian bones yielded a discovery that is, paradoxically, the most significant evidence of the Kaoko's unique end: the complete and utter absence of human remains and signs of conflict. In typical historical contexts, the end of a vast civilization leaves indelible marks, mass graves, layers of ash from war or siege, hastily abandoned artifacts, or evidence of catastrophic environmental failure. The Kaoko left none of this. The subterranean city, the vast dormant artery, the quiescent nodes, and the storage compartments were found precisely as they were last used. Approximately 16,800 years ago, the zero shift point established by the backward calendar. The only evidence of their presence was the faint residue of lumen algae in the cultivation tanks and the minuscule amounts of organic material, likely skin flakes or hair, embedded in the thermal mats of the nodes. Crucially, every single aspect of the city's complex regulatory systems was found to be in perfect working order. Ventilation system. The helical shafts were clear and functioning. demonstrating the Keoko's success at minimizing waste that could clog the vents. The power source, the energy generation system, a mystery in itself, likely exploiting deep earth geothermal gradients through an unknown conversion technology, was found to be not broken, but intentionally deactivated in a systematic, controlled sequence. The temporal spire, as noted, the counting stops abruptly at the zero shift, with the chrononauts' instruments left perfectly arranged, ready for the next observation that never came. The Keoku did not flee, nor were they annihilated. They simply stopped being there, the hypothesis of controlled translation. This perfect exit forms the basis of the most widely accepted and most unsettling academic theory: controlled translation. This hypothesis suggests that the goal of the Keoku was never merely to wait for the omega of time, but to actively remove themselves from the timeline at the precise moment of the zero shift. The Star Eaters, the very name implies a relationship with celestial bodies and vast energies, were not waiting for the universe to end. They were attempting to achieve a state of pre-omega existence. The theory postulates that the extensive research into the obsidian bone's composite structure and the precise measurements of the stellar anchor in the backward calendar were all preparatory steps for a collective technological act of non-local relocation or temporal suspension. Consider the following supporting points. The absence of waste. A key tenet of the Great Stillness was the minimization of metabolic and societal output. If the Keoku achieved a technology capable of transforming matter, their bodies, into energy or information, their final state, they would have left no biological waste. The ultimate adherence to their principle of austerity. The refinement chamber, the massive refinement chamber, used to homogenize obsidian, could have been repurposed. Some researchers believe the ceramic lining was not for containing heat, but for focusing and directing vast amounts of energy derived from their geothermal power source, possibly as a mass energy conversion array during the final moments. The stasis lock. The systematic deactivation of the power source suggests that once the translation was complete, the machines were shut down to ensure the environment remained in perfect stasis, preserving the city as a monument to their successful departure. The Keoku, in this chilling scenario, were the world's first and only successful chrononauts of the peaks. They did not just measure time. They navigated out of it, achieving an eternal, unchanging, non-physical stillness. The echoes of the Star Eater in subsequent cultures. If the Keoku simply vanished, did they truly leave a legacy? The answer, ironically, lies in the things that were not built by later indigenous American cultures, a cultural imprint known as the legacy of the unbuilt for the centuries and millennia immediately following the zero shift. The American continent was inhabited by nomadic groups who, though unrelated to the Keoku, sometimes passed through the general region of the temporal spire and the sealed subterranean city. Anthropologists have observed an anomalous, shared pattern among many early post-Paleo Indian tribes who settled near the Craton: a deep, almost irrational, avoidance of deep, vertical construction, and a cultural taboo against the use of obsidian for major tools or artwork. The taboo of the vertical. While later cultures, like the ancestral Pueblones, built upward, mesa structures, those proximal to the Keoku location displayed a remarkable reluctance to dig or build downward. Folklore from the Caddo and early Wichita cultures, though dating millennia later, speak of the deep silence, a place where the earth eats the sound and the people. This suggests an enduring, nonverbal folk memory of the obsidian bones, the fear of the black glass. Obsidian, despite being an excellent tool material, was often ritually rejected or only used for minor, disposable items by these specific neighboring groups. This stands in stark contrast to its ubiquitous use elsewhere in Mesoamerica. This suggests a learned, ancestral fear of the material, that was the very fabric of the silent, vanishing city.